Hello students. In today's lecture, we will discuss the architecture of the Bahmani kingdom and the temples of the Vijaynagara Empire. We will begin with the Bahmani kingdom. Now, architectural styles in the Bahmani kingdom initially inherited certain features of the Delhi Sultanate, but later absorbed Persian influences. This initiated with Muhammad bin Tughlaq's relocation of a major portion of the population of Delhi to the south. There was also the coming of very sophisticated and extremely accomplished Persian diaspora to these parts. Essentially, a new Deccani style of Islamic architecture emerged from the blending of these two traditions. The extant, rich Hindu forms of temple building had only a marginal impact on the construction activity during this period. Bijapur, Gulbarga, and Bidar were the principal areas where these architectural specimens were found. We find civic and military monuments, tombs, mosques, etc. Now let us look at the forts. Construction for armies stands out in this relatively small Deccani kingdoms. There were strategically important forts in Gulbarga, Bidar, Golconda, and Warangal. These were very grand and spectacular. Usually, after capturing local garrisons and their forts, the Bahmani kings remodeled these military enclosures and added battlements and bastions to them. Gulbarga was circled by very wide double walls and by a moat for extra protection. Its bastions were strong and huge and were crowned by merlons. 2 gates with guard towers and several smaller gates inside these were the principal entry points into the fort. Some European influences could be identified in these structures. Now, within the fort, palaces, halls were teeming spaces of activity. As of now, the only edifice that still stands is the Jami Masjid. The Bidar fort, now totally in ruins, was more expansive and contained the Diwani arm where the famous turquoise throne or the Takht Mahal was placed. There were many Deccani-style tombs. There were in fact about 30 royal tombs which displayed a gradual maturing of the Deccani style of architecture. The earliest and the most important was the mausoleum of Alauddin Bahman Shah, 1358. It had sloping walls, a low dome, fluted finials, and unimpressive arches. These tombs were generally inelegant prototypes of Tughlaq structures. Later, Persian features of architecture in the form of bigger and higher domes with constricted bases appeared. The tomb of Muhammad Shah II, 1397, had a raised dome and a higher base. There was also the Haft Gumbaz, or 7 domes, with connected double chambers for the king and his family members. This can be found in Gulbarga. 4 rulers of the kingdom were buried here. Bidar also had some tombs which sported bulbous domes. The tomb of Ahmed Shah Wali is rather spectacular. It is embellished in the inside by beautiful paintings and inscriptions. Alauddin's tomb in Daulatabad has tiled decorations and arabesque patterns inside and outside. Later on, there was the gold gumbaz of Muhammad Adil Shah at Bijapur. This was a rather large dome. It had, in fact, a rather large dome and spacious tomb chamber, which makes it stand out from similar monuments of the region. The Tatar or the bulbous dome was fully elaborated in Qutub Shah's tomb in Golconda. There were also several mosques in this kingdom, in this Bahmani kingdom, right? The mosques of the period were quite large and more ornate and therefore attracted attention as important public spaces. They displayed elements of Persian artistry in their ornamentations and embellishments. In Gulbarga, there was the Shah Bazar Masjid, right, where Tughlaq specifications of architecture in the Norman North Indian style could be seen. According to Mehrdad Shokhui, this was the original congregational mosque in Gulbarga and not the later Jami Masjid. Now, the Jami Masjid of Gulbarga was an imposing monument whose design and structure was rather unique. It was supposed to have been built in 1367, though later dates have also been suggested. The sheer size of the monument, which could actually accommodate 5,000 devotees, lends it unusual importance in contemporary times. The plan of the building is far removed from the design of the usual Bahmani mosque. In fact, we find a blend of the northern and southern styles in this mosque. This mosque had extensive outer walls. It was completely covered and did not have a courtyard. It was situated within the fort. The building had similarities with pre-Sultanate architecture in the Deccan, as Shokhui points out. There was a wide arched corridor which circumnavigated the three sides, and actually it emulated the typical South Indian mosque design. The arcades of the mosque opened freely outward, and there was an enlarged arch projecting outward in the north, possibly for the use of the Sultan. This was customary in all Jami mosques. However, the basic plan of the mosque was rooted in the south. Right? We have corridors with arcades, vaulted ceilings, big and small domes above, which reflected North Indian influences executed by skilled workers familiar with the northern rules of construction. So while the basic plan remained rooted in the south, the corridors and arcades followed the northern pattern. Clerestories or windows supporting the domes were to become a defining feature of the southern architecture from this time onwards. So, the South Indian mosque plan was blended with the North Indian structure to highlight synchronization with the older Khilji and Tughlaq styles with that of the native Muslims in the south. Now let us proceed to Bidar. Ahmed Shah, the 9th Bahmani ruler, transferred the capital from Gulbarga to Bidar. This naturally led to greater construction activity in Bidar. The large fort at Bidar, with palaces and mosques inside it, a madrasa or a college, and some royal tombs also came up. So we have a lot of different kinds of buildings here. There was the fort of Bidar, which had palaces and mosques, and also we find a madrasa and a college along with some royal tombs. Now, the palaces had very exotic names like Rangin Mahal because they had colorfully decorated exteriors and interiors. There was the Zanana Mahal also. There was also the Darbar Hall and the Diwani Arm and the famous Takht Mahal or throne room. The edifices borrowed heavily from Persian plans and embellishments. The use of glazed tiles was prolific here. The use of glazed tiles and murals absolutely transformed the appearance of these structures, embellished with arabesque designs and vibrant colors. Now, while the secular structures were very colorful and ostentatious, the Jami Masjid and the Sola Khamba Masjid in Bidar fort were rather austere by contrast. Both the mosques looked back stylistically by adopting the open courtyard, pillared sanctuary and domed nave. The Sola Khamba Masjid had 16 columns on its facade and a dome, raised on a cylindrical structure with arched openings. One of the greatest public buildings constructed in South India was the Madrasa of Mahmud Gawan in Bidar. Built in 1472, it was meant to replicate his own college in Persia in style and functionality. Now let us look at the madrasa. The madrasa was a stately monument containing lecture halls, library, and living quarters for professors and students. The students from Persia and West Asia flocked to Bidar and utilized the immense intellectual and other facilities that the college had on offer. Now, this building had two massive minars in front and contained a library and lecture rooms for students from Persia and West Asia. The main entrance to the edifice was flanked by tall minars rising up in three parts, while its walls were divided into 3 stories of arched windows. The other 3 sides had semi-octagonal projections that rose high and were topped by tartar or bulbous domes. At the center of the huge structure was a quadrangle from which halls and chambers opened out on all sides. The walls were decorated with radiant green, white, and yellow glazed tiles, with breathtaking calligraphy and arabesque and foliate patterns. The edifice was heavily embellished with inscriptions from sacred texts. We will now come to Vijaynagara. Right. Now, we all know that Vijaynagara had absolutely resplendent monuments which were both secular and functional, as well as religious and therefore sacred. Here, architectural styles were majorly Hindu, though flashes of Islamic influence can be found in certain later monuments. The remains of most of the secular and utilitarian edifices can be found in its major metropolis. Initially situated at Anegondi, to the north of the river Tungabhadra, the city of Vijayanagara's axis sharply and rapidly shifted to the south, whence it came to be known as the capital of the kingdom. The urban development of Vijayanagara reached its peak as it transformed itself from a humble Shaiva pilgrimage center to a well-guarded and thriving capital of the great kingdom in the mid-14th to the early 15th century. Now, it had 7 walls of fortification and 7 citadels, according to Abdul Razak of Herat. Today, 1 wall remains, encompassing the royal center. Now, this royal center contained palaces, the audience hall or Mahanavami Dibba, the Ramachandra or Hazara temple, and much more. Archaeological excavations have revealed tanks, roads, gates, bastions, stepped wells, and many such secular structures. Fortifications to Vijayanagara were always strengthened because we know there was a continuing hostility with the Bahmani kingdom, and gates were added to its walls. There were the Sringarada Hebbagilu, the Somavarada Bagilu, or gates to the east during the time of Bukka. The Betekara Habbagilu, that is the Hunter's Gate, and Hodea Bagilu to the north were added during the time of Harihara. Now let us look at the temples. We will talk about the temples in its early phase. We must remember that the temples here developed in phases. And we all know, and I have mentioned before, that Vijaynagara had temples of the most breathtaking beauty. The early 14th century saw temples that were simple and uncomplicated in structure. These were normally established by the ruling elites such as officials, Brahmins or ministers, not by the monarch himself. They usually contained a Garbhagriha, an Antarala and Mandapa and were very sparingly embellished. During the reign of Harihara II, the Narasimha temple, an important place of Vaishnava worship, the Oretya Mailara Deva, essentially a Shiva temple, the Kinnu Jinanath temple, a Jain Chaita, and a temple of Virupaksha on Hemkut Hill were some of the places of worship constructed in the last quarter of the 14th century. So these structures of the 14th century in general represented the early reticent style of temple construction in the region. This changed somewhat in the 15th century when Vijayanagara architecture became more decorative and bold. It was sponsored by important ministers or by the king himself. At the same time, of course, some temples did retain their subdued character, while others stood out and flaunted their embellishments and grandeur. Finally, it was in the 16th century that the temples of Vijayanagara reached the pinnacle of glory. They combined elaborate plans, massive size, added amazingly spectacular gates or gopuras to present some fascinating architecture to the people. Needless to say, they were mostly patronized by the monarchs themselves and definitely reflected the wealth that was showered upon them. Now let us concentrate on the second phase. The second phase was represented by a second Jain temple at Anegodi, built by the minister Irugappain in 1402, and another shrine with a mandapa dedicated to Gopinatha within the precincts of the Narasimha temple mentioned above. The same period also saw one of the most eye-catching temples of Vijayanagara, the Ramachandra temple, situated at the core of the royal centre. It was built during the reign of Devaraya I. After him, the king Mallikarjuna erected a shrine whose important points of attraction were two portrait sculptures. One was of the king Mallikarjuna himself, and the second was of his attendant Srirangu, who had actually put together the structure. In subsequent eras, the Virupaksha temple received great attention from the monarchs. Devaraya II was very magnanimous towards the Jains and constructed a chaitya dedicated to Parshvanath in 1426. This was situated in the royal centre on one of the main roads, which was in the market area. It catered to commercial groups, of whom a major portion was Jain. Attention to Muslim architecture or culture was not lacking completely, for there was a mosque constructed by Ahmed Khan, an officer who was among the innumerable Muslims who served in Vijayanagara under Devaraya II. At the end of the 15th century, the Vithala temple was built, though the exact date of its foundation is really not known. Now, most of the above temples conformed more or less to the Deccan tradition of architecture. These plain Deccan-styled shrines normally had a maximum of 3 small sanctuaries which opened into a common covered mandapa. What was a mandapa? The mandapa was really a pillared hall-like structure open at the sides, sometimes bordered with slabs to provide seating arrangements. The exterior remained unembellished and austere, though the vimanas, that is, the chariots of the gods, were given pyramidal structures as adornments. The Virupaksha temple on Hemkut Hill was built in 1398. From the outside, we can see the Garbhagriha, the Antarala and Mandapa, though the latter might have been added afterwards. The plain Vimana placed on a high plinth and the Mandapa also stands on a plain plinth. So the Vimana is placed on a high plinth and the Mandapa is also on a plain plinth. The interior of the Garbhagriha has a ceiling embossed with a lotus medallion, flanked by 2 squares, but is otherwise pristine and without embellishments. The Mandapa has 12 outer pillars and 4 on the inside. They stand on square molded bases with capitals sporting a disc and a falaka. Let us come to the third phase. The second style of architecture which prevailed in South India was the Tamil tradition, right? So the third phase of architecture was actually the Tamil tradition. The first style of architecture was the Deccani tradition. The second was the Tamil tradition, right? And Tamil tradition was definitely very ornate. The shrines here were normally built of granite with vimanas and mandapas decorated with beautiful superstructures and parapets made of brick and plaster. The entrance or gopuras were sturdy constructions with central passageways. Above there were pyramid-shaped towers which merged with sala roof designs that took the form of barrel vaults. So the sala roof design was the barrel vaulted design. Now, walls of the temples had rib-like projections and recesses acquired with the help of pilasters. Sculptures in the niches of the projections were highlighted with the help of pediments. These had kapota or cornice capped by sala or barrel vaulted roofs. A very typical embellishment in these structures was the kumbha panjaras or floral designs and tassels. The pilasters and pots were decorated with these. Now, the 15th century temples, we are going back a little, 15th, 16th. So, the 15th century temples were both ornate and simple, right? So, they were essentially of 2 kinds. On the one hand, the Ramchandra temple was spectacular and imposing and ushered in much of the stylistic features of the next century. In contrast, the Jaina temple at Anegodi and the Parshvanath Jaina temple erected by Devaraya II, as well as the Someswara temple, were understated and comparatively plain structures adhering to the Deccan tradition. The Ramachandra temple was definitely among the most intricately designed edifices of the south. The Tamil style prevailed here. It also anticipated the even more dazzling and sensational architecture of the Tuluva period. Let us look at the details of the Ramachandra temple. The Ramachandra temple was built as a royal shrine by Devaraya I. It had a sanctuary, 2 antechambers, and a Ranga Mandapa with porches in the east, north, and south. Later, another Mandapa was attached to it. The main temple stood on a decorated plinth, while the principal edifice was embellished with pilasters to create projections and recesses in which stood carvings and decorative kumbha panjaras. So this was very typical of the very ornate and decorative South Indian temple, or the temple of Vijaynagara, right? So there were also some typical Vijaynagara columns inside, topped by pushpa pagodigai corbels. The entire structure was placed on a rectangular courtyard enclosed by beautifully carved walls. There were gates in the north and east, and these were accompanied by verandas. And there were also, however, overhead towers or gopuras of the later Tamil temple is missing here. Now, the 16th century architecture reached new benchmarks in Vijaynagara, right? So, building skills acquired a new level altogether in the 16th century. There were elaborate gopuras, maharanga mandapas, upapithas, and adhishtanas. Most of the shrines had shallow projections and resources decorated with pilasters, kumbha panjaras, and sculptures of deities in its niches. There were, however, exceptions, such as the 16th century Anantasayana temple, where the walls of the main shrine are plain, devoid of pilasters and kumbha panjaras. Now, the Virupaksha temple received a lot of attention, right? So, Krishnadevaraya transformed the Virupaksha temple by adding a Maharanga Mandapa to the main shrine and an inner Gopura in the east. This he did in order to celebrate his coronation. The Maharanga Mandapa is a large, open, pillared hall with granite roofs, surrounded by cut-out colonnettes and supported by crouching yalis or mythical beasts. The Gopura in the east had an Upapitha and Adhisthana, decorated once more with projections, recesses, pilasters, and intricate carvings of Kumbha Panjaras and other deities. Kapota cornices adorn the upper end of the walls. The gate is topped by a pyramidal brick tower containing 3 layers and is capped by a decorated sala with horseshoe ends. The basic pattern of the strikingly beautiful 16th century Vijayanagara temples could be found in the Virupaksha complex. The Vithala temple was also beautified by the queens of Krishnadevaraya in 1513. They were embellished with Makara Toranas and the Upapitha. Designed door jambs, the motif of the Ganga, carvings of Vaishnava Dwarpalas, and sculptures of deities at the base added to the resplendence of the structure. Krishnadevaraya made another addition to the Vithala temple. This was a 100-pillared hall in the southwest of the main shrine, the first of its kind in a temple complex in South India. 2 temples built by Krishnadevaraya, the Krishna and the Anantasayana temples, were remarkable. The first was established in the context of his victory over the Gajapatis of Odisha, from whom he captured the hill fort of Udaygiri. An enclosed rectangular courtyard encompasses these structures. A new element is added here in the form of a colonnaded chariot street from the outer compound, while a water tank and a pavilion with in its center stands towards the north. The splendor of the Tamil style reverberates throughout this temple. Taller and more embellished gopuras and larger mandapas and enclosures mark the Tiruvengalanatha temple at the time of Achyutaraya and the Pattabhirama temple of the same period. Mention must be made of the swing pavilion, Mahamandapa Oruyale Mandapa, which was added to the Vithala temple, and the double curved cave standing above the piers. The entire pier is cut out of a single block of granite, testifying to the skill and experience of the craftsmen who were involved. The mandapa stands on an embellished platform carved intricately with friezes of animals as well as with the 10 avatars of Vishnu. It is the most intricately designed and famous specimen of Vijayanagara architecture. So we may conclude by saying that the temples of Vijaynagara evolved from the 14th to the 16th century and represented a synthesis of both the Deccan and Tamil architectural traditions. They progressed from being small and simple structures to temple complexes defined by heavily embellished, magnificent constructions of large dimensions. Many new features, such as the composite pillar, the chariot street, and 100-pillared hall, were visible. Though the 16th century temples were generally grand in scale, some small and simple ones also existed, such as the Muduvirana and Tiruvengalanatha in Krishnapur, which came up during this period. So, while the Tamil style dominated, the features of the Deccan style were still applied in the temples of the 15th and 16th centuries. Thank you.